Hi there again, this is Dr. Coates. This is one of, I guess, 3 videos that I'm going to be posting on Tuesday the 22nd. This first one is, I'm hoping to be really individualized for your particular class conversation, although I'm using a transcript that I might use in future classes that do more or less the same subject matter. So I'll be calling out a few of you. I do want to make sure that you sort of read or listen to this one first and then see the other one, and then the example of analyzing one of the poems based on what I'm talking about in the second lecture. So you should do this in order, but I wanted to break them up just so that you'd have a chance of getting up and stretching your legs or what have you. So anyway, so this is number 1 on Tuesday the 23rd, and 22nd, and I hope you all had a wonderful MLK Day holiday / observation. And most of what I'm doing right now is to talk to you about the Twitter conversation that we had over the weekend, which I was very pleased with, and I hope you were too. So anyway, I can already tell you this is going to be a fun class for me, and I hope that pleasure spreads to all of you as well. I taught 3 sections of a writing course online last term, which made me feel pretty isolated as I recorded all of my videos in this office, this one, and rarely interacted with my students, although sometimes on Skype, or if they were hard up, they would come to my office. That's one reason I wanted to be sure I built in a substantial discussion basis for the course, which I hope I'm not overcompensating with, but you can tell me as we go on. Clearly, there's still a place for writing in any English course, right? And I have not eliminated that, even though I've sort of shoved it into our exams. But we need to be able to rely on each other as resources for learning, and I'm delighted by your willingness and aptitude to respond on Twitter, and especially by your collective forthrightness and sincerity, so please do keep that up. In the Twitter discussions we'll have from now on, I'd like to encourage as much as possible that you speak to one another, instead of only responding to my original prompt. It's there to get you going, but ideally the conversation will branch out and flourish in its subject matter, and I see my role as one in which I redirect topics or rein in tangents, or help expand complex points and praise great ideas when I see them. My object is not to make sure that my own ideas win the conversation, but more to facilitate your learning through bouncing ideas off of each other, and that's the sort of seminar quality that I'm hoping to create in the online environment. To that end, from now on, the expectation is that you will tweet at least twice per conversation, with at least one of those tweets explicitly responding to a classmate. Even if that response is just something like, "I really love that point," that's enough. It's enough. When you're in the classroom, you have the benefit of looking around and seeing if people are nodding or not nodding. On Twitter, you don't have that unless people actually tell you that they agree or disagree. And I just remind you again, it's a free medium. It doesn't matter how often we tweet. And it's an easy way of getting on the board. I was thrilled to see, for example, Sarah and Emily Driver and Gabriella responding directly to Emily McKinnon's tweet yesterday. Those are great instincts. So thank you very much for doing that, and I'd like to encourage everybody else. Take a look at what they did. I don't think it was that hard, but I do think it made a big difference to the original tweeter and to everybody that came afterward. So, the 2 tweets per discussion are a minimum, of course. You should feel free to tweet as often as you have something to add. And my hope is that we will all be talking with one another a great deal through the semester. I only ask that you use the #VizPoem hashtag with every single tweet you make for this course so that we can search for them, and so that I can weed out extraneous tweets from students I've followed, which is all of you, from others that I shouldn't be reading. For example, on Sunday night, Quinn had a lot of understandable tweets from the AFC Championship game that, while entertaining, weren't really about poetry. The hashtag lets us all focus the conversation and simulate the classroom, and I feel like I need to stress a few times how necessary it is to put it on your class tweets, especially if this is the first time you've used Twitter, especially if you're talking to one another about their comments, right? If you're just responding to me, then I'll have the @Jason_Coates to help me organize it, but if I hadn't followed you, I wouldn't be able to find it when you talk to one another. And I'd like to be able to reward that participation too. So if you put that hashtag in, and I can search for it, and I can see everything that's been said on a given conversation. And I think that's what we want. And also I can train myself not to read, the tweets that just come in from one of you that I'm following. From all of you that I'm following. Also, although you should feel free to continue conversations once we have moved on, there will be no good way to separate comments directed at a previous Twitter conversation from the current one. and I may find myself asking you to move on to the one that we're currently doing. This is also the reason why there's really no way of catching up if you miss one of our conversations, or if you miss your opportunity to submit tweets. That's the reason why I'm just going to ask you to submit them for the one that we're doing now. You can't go back in time. And it's the same thing as like missing a day of class and therefore not being able to enter into that conversation. Just because we moved it online doesn't mean that, you can just... we really don't want to keep like 42 different conversations going in parallel. I think that would be impossible. So, and also, that's one of the reasons why each one of these Twitter conversations has an extended duration during which you can tweet. So, hopefully it's not... If at any point you find yourself unable to do it within, say, like a 36-hour period, just let me know. I can always post the prompts a little bit earlier. We're still going to have to close them up at some point, though. So, right. I'm going to keep including that hashtag VizPoem in all of my tweets. Every time I put a new one out, I'll put a hashtag that's like, the number sign, and then new 215 prompt. And I'll do this, though, the one I'll be sending out at noon today. So you can also search for those. If you're like, oh, I may have missed it, you can always just search for that hashtag, and then you'll find the thing that you're supposed to be responding to. Okay, so about your tweets. In general, this was a really illuminating conversation to have because it's instructive about how many different connotations there are out there for poetry. I suspect, first of all, that you all associate poetry with quite a few other connotations that you aren't mentioning, like its difficulty or how off-putting it can be to come across a poem that seems to be going out of its way to obscure what the person is trying to say to you, or the fact that they seem to be obeying a lot of different rules which are never explicitly spelled out for you. Or perhaps you associate poetry with a particularly bad experience that you had with an English class in high school, which I just want to remind you I had nothing to do with. So hopefully by airing out these connotations, we can try to set them aside and see what we can do with poems in a fresh way that has nothing to do with your earlier trauma. Still, it's pretty clear from reading through your tweets that some of you are using poetry as a mode, and some of you are thinking of a pretty specific subgenre of poetry rather than the entire set. And here, let me explain what I mean by that. A literary mode is an aesthetic tactic or characteristic that can appear in multiple genres. It's one way of accounting for the blending of genres that inevitably happens. If you find a dramatic poem, like Frost's The Witch of Cowes, it's still properly a poem that has elements of drama in it rather than the other way around. Similarly, if you're reading a novel in which the author has taken pains to write in a stylized way in first-person voice, we might call that a lyric narrative. Like, for example, Virginia Woolf's novel The Waves, which features 6 alternating protagonist narrators. So maybe you're defining poetry as a sort of high-quality language that permeates other literature and sometimes everyday life. For example, maybe you thought the president's second inaugural address, although clearly an essay, had poetic qualities to its language. I did too, if you're like me. It's still not a poem, right? It's an essay. I once had a dinner guest tell me, the fish was a poem, which, it's not, it was fish. I took it to be a compliment, although perhaps you had to be there. I thought it was good, but I don't know about poem. Anyway, however, defining poetry like that doesn't account for the so-called plain language poetry, which is now in vogue. And in here, Robert Frost again can be a great example of that. In plain language poetry, or ordinary language poetry, effort has been made to create poetry out of everyday speech, rather than recognizably beautiful language. And with good reason, since literary tastes change over time. If you look at language in an ancient poem like Western Wind, on the list for this week, and compare it with some of the 19th century examples by Wordsworth or Elizabeth Barrett Browning, and then with some of the more, the ones from the 20th century, you can see that those tastes did indeed change over time. Although ordinary language as it appears in poetry is still not really language that you and I might say in everyday life. For example, even in a lecture which is mostly scripted, like the one that I'm giving right now, it's not how I talk at home, and probably not the way that you would either. And there's a lot more ums and uhs that we all put in. If you saw a transcript of a conversation with your friends, I'm sure you'd be as shocked as some that I've seen of myself. Just because we don't all talk in elaborate, complete sentences all the time, much though we might like to. There you go. Anyway, so it's more a depiction of what we think should appear within poetry, rather than somebody's transcript of something that they heard out on the street, which may not have been all that interesting to read anyway, so it's for the best. Anyway, language changes over time, poetry changes over time, mostly because of what our general cultural tastes about what should appear in poetry is changing over time. It's not constant. I can't even guarantee that our contemporary vogue for the everyday language will last much longer, because it's not really up to me or you. Partly it's what poets will continue to do, and what audiences will continue to receive or buy, I suppose. However, having said that, it's still true that you're allowed to like whichever poems you like. So hopefully that's an encouraging thought. Just rock on with your with your love of Shel Silverstein, if that's you. As for subgenres, this is the other thing that I was noticing. Those of you who define poetry as any vehicle for self-expression, you are being imprecise, and I should also say you're being unfair to essays and fiction and drama, all of which are also vehicles for self-expression, and they deserve their little shout-out as well. Some poetic genres, like free verse, it's in the name, allow for absolute freedom to write however the poet likes. You can be in a stanza, but it doesn't have to be. It can be a line of whatever length. It doesn't have to rhyme, etc., etc. But I have to say that most poetic genres do not have that characteristic. And I wouldn't be so quick to equate generic rules, by which I mean, like a sonnet has 14 lines and probably has some rhyme schemes. I don't want to have you equate that with some sort of harsh restriction or censorship. There are compensations to being able to refer to other authors who have in the past said eloquent things on the same subject without ever having to name them explicitly, but being confident that your reader will automatically bring those associations to bear on the thing that you're writing. It's a rather powerful tool, and people that write free verse are kind of doing away with that. That, let's call it almost like a stepladder that allows you to reach higher and higher, merely because of the genre that you've chosen to write in. Also, keep in mind that poets like challenges. Most subgeneric rules are not that hard. Blank verse, for example, which is what Shakespeare wrote all of his plays in, needs to be an iambic pentameter, but it doesn't need to rhyme. That's it. It's the only rule is that it's an iambic pentameter. Milton also wrote Paradise Lost in blank verse. It's one of our, in the English language at least, it's one of the most popular genres that we've got within poetry. Even rhyme schemes aren't really all that hard, since there is this thing called slant rhyme, which has become more popular over time, especially in the 20th century, which is another way of talking about assonance, which is the vowel sounds are the same, but maybe not all the consonants match up perfectly. And on our list of poems for this week, I might point out Emily Dickinson as your best example of slant rhyme. It's usually near enough, but not a perfect rhyme, as we might say. And we'll talk about this some more. But just, I want to put them on the table. There are some poems, like sonnets or sestinas and villanelles. They have a lot of rules. And you have to follow at least most of them if you want them to be recognizable as sonnets or sestinas or villanelles. And therefore a part of that conversation that the poet intends the text to be a part of. Again, not because of some sort of slavish devotion to rules as such, but because it makes the reading experience richer if it's going in tandem with these other examples of the genre. That's what genres do. So what I'm going to do with the next Twitter prompt is I'm basically just going to pose almost exactly the same question, but hopefully now with the benefit of this lecture, the one that's going to be coming in just a second, and the example that I'll walk you through for how to apply what I'm going to say in the next lecture. My hope is that we'll come up with better definitions. Not that the ones that we already did were bad, because as I say, this was instructive, and it was great to have you all talking to one another. And that's what the first module is about, is to try to introduce what these conversations will be like in this class online. But keep in mind that your goal is as follows. You want to be able to come up with a definition for poetry in this Twitter conversation, which is kind of practice, and also in the defining the genre exercise that you're doing within your groups. The goal is to have you come up with a definition which is, precise enough to explain the genre to yourselves, rather than that one particular subgenre that you may have had in your mind, like free verse, or the whole poetic mode as such, like defining what you find poetic, because that can be, sort of too easily collapsed into language that I like, or that I have been taught to expect within poetry. Um, language that rhymes, for example, is not necessarily a good example for poetry. But also general enough to encompass all of the examples that I put into the Defining the Genre exercise folder, right? And keep in mind that I chose a lot of those examples in order to fight back against like too quick assumptions of what poetry has to be. Like, for example, there's T.S. Eliot's prose poem Hysteria, which isn't even in lines, it's just a paragraph, and yet it's still a poem. So we'll have to keep that in mind as we try to have our conversations about how to define this thing to ourselves. So anyway, I'll give you a few ways of trying to make these definitions in the next lecture, which I encourage you to watch right now or after you go to the bathroom or what have you. Get some tea or cocoa. And that's why you should watch that, and make sure that you've read all the poems for this week before you begin your next batch of tweeting. Best of luck, and thank you for watching.